Breaking tonight. In a decisive 8-1 ruling, the United States Supreme Court has struck down key protections under a state's so-called Second Amendment Preservation Act, sending a powerful message about the limits of state authority when it comes to federal gun laws. The Second Amendment Preservation Act, often abbreviated as SAPA, is a type of state law designed to limit the enforcement of certain federal gun regulations within a state's borders. The most prominent example came from Missouri, where lawmakers passed legislation declaring that specific federal firearm laws were unconstitutional and therefore invalid within the state. Supporters argued that the measure was necessary to defend residents' Second Amendment rights from what they viewed as federal overreach. Under Missouri's version of the law, state and local law enforcement agencies were prohibited from assisting federal authorities in enforcing particular federal gun regulations. The law also included penalties for state officials who cooperated with federal enforcement efforts related to those targeted regulations. In effect, the state sought not only to withdraw its own participation, but also to discourage collaboration with federal agencies such as the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Backers of the legislation framed it as an assertion of state sovereignty. They relied on a constitutional principle often called the anti-commandeering doctrine, which says the federal government cannot force states to use their resources to carry out federal policies. From their perspective, refusing to help enforce federal gun laws was a legitimate exercise of that principle. However, critics argued that the law went further than simply declining cooperation. By labeling federal laws invalid and threatening penalties for compliance, opponents contended that the act attempted to interfere with federal authority itself. That tension between non-cooperation and active obstruction ultimately became central to the legal challenge that reached the Supreme Court. At the center of the case was a foundational constitutional issue: whether a state has the authority to invalidate or obstruct federal law simply because it disagrees with it. The dispute turned on the meaning and force of the Supremacy Clause in Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution. That clause establishes that the Constitution and federal laws made pursuant to it are the supreme law of the land, meaning that when state and federal laws conflict, federal law prevails. The state defending its Preservation Act argued that it was exercising its sovereign powers under the 10th Amendment. Supporters relied heavily on the anti-commandeering doctrine, a principle the Supreme Court has recognized in prior cases. Under that doctrine, the federal government cannot require states or their officers to enforce federal regulatory programs. States are generally free to decline participation in federal enforcement efforts, but the federal government and the challengers argued that the state had crossed a constitutional line. There is an important distinction between refusing to help enforce a federal law and attempting to nullify it. While states may choose not to use their own personnel or resources to implement federal policy, they cannot declare federal statutes invalid within their borders, nor can they impose penalties that interfere with federal officers carrying out their duties. This tension reflects a long-standing debate in American constitutional law over nullification, the theory that states can reject federal laws they consider unconstitutional. The Supreme Court has repeatedly rejected that theory, maintaining that disputes over constitutionality must ultimately be resolved by the judiciary. In this case, the justices were asked to clarify whether the state's actions amounted to permissible non-cooperation or unconstitutional obstruction of federal authority. In an 8-1 decision, the Supreme Court concluded that the state's Second Amendment Preservation Act violated the Constitution because it went beyond permissible non-cooperation and ventured into active interference with federal law. The majority opinion focused on the distinction between a state declining to assist federal authorities and a state attempting to undermine federal authority itself. The justices reaffirmed that under the anti-commandeering doctrine, states cannot be forced to use their own officials or resources to enforce federal regulatory programs. That principle has been recognized in cases such as Prince v. United States, where the court held that the federal government could not require local law enforcement officers to conduct background checks under federal gun legislation. In other words, states are free to step back and refuse participation. However, the majority found that this Preservation Act did more than simply opt out. By declaring certain federal gun laws invalid within the state and threatening penalties against local officials who cooperated with federal enforcement, the statute directly conflicted with the Supremacy Clause. The court emphasized that states cannot nullify federal law or punish individuals for complying with it. Such actions create a constitutional conflict because federal law must remain supreme and enforceable nationwide. The justices also expressed concern that allowing states to impose penalties for cooperation with federal authorities would disrupt the functioning of federal law enforcement. It could deter information sharing, joint investigations, and partnerships that are common in criminal justice efforts. Ultimately, the court concluded that while states may refuse to help, they cannot obstruct, penalize, or attempt to invalidate federal statutes. That line, the majority said, is critical to preserving the constitutional balance between state sovereignty and federal supremacy. Although the decision was overwhelmingly 8-1, the single dissenting justice offered a sharply different view of how the Constitution should apply in this case. The dissent did not dispute the importance of the Supremacy Clause or the general principle that federal law takes precedence over conflicting state law. Instead, the disagreement centered on how far the state had actually gone and whether the majority overstated the degree of interference. The dissenting justice argued that the state's law could be interpreted more narrowly as primarily an expression of non-cooperation rather than nullification. In this view, the statute was aimed at directing state and local officials not to participate in enforcing certain federal gun regulations. The dissent suggested that the majority blurred the distinction between a state declining to assist and a state actively obstructing federal authority. Another key theme in the dissent was federalism, the idea that states retain significant sovereign powers under the Constitution. The justice emphasized that states have broad discretion in deciding how to allocate their law enforcement resources. If a state chooses to prioritize its own laws and policies over assisting federal agencies, the dissent suggested that such a choice falls within traditional state authority. The dissent also reflected a broader debate over how aggressively courts should scrutinize state efforts to push back against federal regulation, particularly in sensitive areas like gun rights. While the majority saw the statute as a direct constitutional conflict, the dissent viewed it as a closer case, one that required careful parsing of what the law actually required and prohibited. Even though it did not change the outcome, the dissent signals that future disputes over federal-state tensions could still divide the court. The Supreme Court's ruling has immediate implications beyond the state directly involved in the case. In recent years, several states have enacted or considered laws modeled on the same Second Amendment Preservation Act framework, aiming to limit cooperation with federal gun enforcement efforts. This decision sends a clear constitutional warning. States cannot declare federal firearm laws invalid, nor can they penalize officials for assisting federal authorities. For lawmakers in other states, the message is both clarifying and cautionary. The court did not eliminate the anti-commandeering doctrine. States still retain the authority to decline participation in federal regulatory programs. They can choose not to allocate their own personnel, funding, or resources toward enforcing federal gun laws. That remains a recognized and protected aspect of state sovereignty. However, the ruling draws a firm boundary. States may not go further by attempting to obstruct federal operations, interfere with federal investigations, or create legal consequences for cooperation with federal agencies. Any statute that crosses into that territory is now highly vulnerable to constitutional challenge. In practical terms, states with similar preservation-style laws may need to revise or narrow them to avoid direct conflict with the Supremacy Clause. Legal advisors and state attorneys general will likely re-examine statutory language to ensure it focuses solely on non-cooperation rather than invalidation or punishment. Ongoing litigation in other jurisdictions could also be influenced by this precedent, as lower courts look to the Supreme Court's reasoning for guidance. Politically, the ruling may intensify debates in state legislatures about how best to protect gun rights within constitutional limits. Lawmakers supportive of strong Second Amendment protections may shift strategies, focusing on litigation or policy reform rather than statutory nullification efforts that risk being struck down. Beyond the immediate impact on state legislation, the court's decision reinforces a broader constitutional principle about how power is divided in the American system. At its core, the ruling is not simply about firearms policy. It is about federalism, the structure that allocates authority between state governments and the federal government. The Constitution creates a system in which both levels of government have defined spheres of power, but it also makes clear that federal law prevails when there is a direct conflict. The Second Amendment itself has been the subject of major Supreme Court rulings in recent decades. In District of Columbia v. Heller, The court recognized an individual right to possess firearms for lawful purposes, such as self-defense within the home. Later decisions expanded on that interpretation. However, those cases addressed the scope of the right to bear arms, not the ability of states to nullify federal statutes. This latest ruling underscores that constitutional disagreements over federal gun regulations must be resolved through the courts, not through unilateral state action. If a state believes a federal law violates the Second Amendment, its remedy is to challenge that law in federal court. It cannot declare the law void within its own borders or create barriers that prevent federal authorities from carrying out their duties. The decision therefore reaffirms a consistent theme in Supreme Court jurisprudence. The Constitution provides mechanisms for resolving disputes, but it does not allow states to override federal authority. Even in areas of intense political and constitutional debate, the supremacy of federal law remains a cornerstone of the system. In that sense, the case serves as a reminder that the structure of government can be just as consequential as the rights at issue.